He was a king in the rap game, platinum records, sold out arenas, a life most could only dream of. Fans worshipped him, critics respected him, and his name carried weight in the industry. But behind the flashing lights and million-dollar deals, something much darker was brewing. Fame had given him everything, but it had also fed his demons. Paranoia. Rage. An obsession with control. And when the walls started closing in, when the life he had so carefully built threatened to slip through his fingers, he didn't just fight back. He destroyed everything in his path. What started as whispers of infidelity turned into something far more sinister. A confrontation behind the walls of his Atlanta mansion led to bloodshed. A secret rendezvous became a crime scene. And in just one night, the man who had once stood at the top of the world became the subject of a nationwide manhunt. How does a superstar with the world at his feet throw it all away? What drove him to cross the line from betrayal to cold-blooded murder? And when it all came crashing down, why did he choose to run? This is the story of Kwame Renshaw, his rise, his downfall, and the shocking crimes that turned the hip-hop icon into a fugitive. Before we unravel this chilling tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more cases of fame, power, and deadly secrets. Before Kwame K-Dub Renshaw became a household name, before the platinum plaques and the private jets, he was just a kid from Atlanta trying to survive. Born and raised in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods, Kwame learned early that the world wasn't kind to those without power. His father was gone before he was old enough to remember him, and his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. By the time he was 13, he had already seen more violence than most experience in a lifetime. Music was his escape. It started with freestyling on the block, his words sharp, his delivery raw. People listened because his rhymes weren't just clever, they were real. He rapped about what he saw, what he lived. And by the time he was 21, his voice had made its way far beyond the streets. A viral mixtape caught the attention of one of the biggest labels in the game, and just like that, Kwame went from local talent to rap's next big thing. The industry embraced him. His debut album shattered records, his aggressive, no-holds-barred storytelling resonating with fans who saw him as the voice of the struggle. The money poured in. The fame came fast. And so did the pressure. The bigger he got, the more he felt like he had to protect what he had built. He didn't trust easily. He kept his circle tight, but even those closest to him knew, Kwame wasn't just another rapper. He was a man who demanded control, in his career, in his relationships, in everything. And no one knew that better than his wife, Zara Renshaw. She had been there since the beginning. When Kwame was 23 and still grinding to make a name for himself, Zara was right by his side. She was 20, a college student with dreams of her own, but somehow, they just fit. She believed in him before the world did, stuck with him through the long nights in the studio, through the money struggles, through the doubt. And when his career exploded, he made her his wife. To the public, they were the perfect couple, Kwame, the superstar rapper, and Zara, the devoted wife who had been with him before the fame. But behind the glitz and glamour, their marriage was far from perfect. Kwame was always surrounded by temptation. Women threw themselves at him. Rumors followed him everywhere he went. Zara heard the whispers, saw the headlines. At first, she ignored them, convinced herself they were just gossip. But deep down, she knew. She knew about the late nights that turned into early mornings, the mysterious phone calls he always took in private. She knew about the perfume that wasn't hers, the hotel charges that had no explanation. For years, she endured it. Because she loved him. Because she had built her life around him. Because, in a way, she had convinced herself that as long as he came home to her, it didn't matter. But love can only blind you for so long. Kwame was a man used to getting what he wanted. Money. Power. Women. And as his fame grew, so did his ego. He wasn't just a rapper anymore, he was an empire. A king in his world. And kings don't answer to anyone. not even their wives. But what happens when the queen decides she's had enough? For years, Zara played her role. She smiled for the cameras, stood by his side at award shows, posted the perfect captions on social media. But the truth was, she was suffocating. The lies, the humiliation, the endless cycle of betrayal, it was all too much. Kwame Renshaw had spent years building his empire, but even the strongest empires have cracks. And for him, one of those cracks was named Amira Caldwell. She wasn't just another woman throwing herself at a rapper. Amira was different. She was young, just 21 when they met, beautiful in a way that made men lose their minds, and smart enough to know exactly how much power that gave her. She had built a name for herself as a model and influencer, her face gracing magazine covers, her Instagram filled with sun-drenched vacations and designer labels. But behind the filters and brand deals, Amira wanted something more. And she found it in Kwame. Their affair started 6 years ago, in a quiet corner of a high-end lounge in Miami. Kwame had noticed her before, scrolling past her photos, admiring from a distance. That night, she was even more stunning in person, long legs crossed, a cocktail in hand, laughing at something whispered in her ear by a man she clearly had no real interest in. Kwame didn't have to introduce himself. She already knew who he was. Everyone did. But when he leaned in, his voice low and confident, there was something different about the way she looked at him. She wasn't starstruck. She wasn't chasing clout. She just smiled, slow and knowing, and said, "I was wondering when you'd finally come say something." That was all it took. For Kwame, Amira was an escape. With her, he wasn't K-Dub, the larger-than-life rap star. He was just Kwame, a man who could let his guard down, if only for a little while. She never asked questions about where he had to be, never demanded to be his only one. She understood the game. She played her role perfectly. But make no mistake, she knew she had a hold on him. Whenever he was with her, the chaos of his life faded. In private penthouses and hidden getaways, she made him forget the pressure, the expectations, the weight of the empire he had to protect. And he gave her everything she wanted: jewelry, designer bags, business investments. A life most women could only dream of. But there was one problem. Zara. For 6 years, Kwame had managed to keep his two worlds separate. Zara was his foundation, the woman who had been with him from the start. She played the role of the loyal wife, and as long as she didn't ask too many questions, everything worked. But even a woman who had learned to turn a blind eye has a breaking point. And Zara's came with a simple text message. The video was grainy, but it didn't need to be clear for her to recognize her own husband. Kwame, walking out of a luxury hotel, his arm draped around another woman's waist. A hoodie pulled low over his face, but not low enough. It was him. There was no denying it. Zara sat frozen, staring at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known, of course, she had known, but knowing and seeing were two different things. The rage bubbled up so fast she could barely breathe. For years, she had played the good wife. The understanding wife. The woman who smiled at award shows while whispers followed her down red carpets. But this? This was a public humiliation she couldn't ignore. And this time, she wasn't going to be silent. She was done looking the other way. Done pretending. Kwame had no idea, but the walls around him were already starting to close in. And the woman he had underestimated the most was about to remind him exactly who she was. August 14th. A night that should have been like any other. But inside Kwame Renshaw's sprawling $5 million Atlanta mansion, everything was about to change. The walls that had protected his secrets, his lies, his carefully curated empire, were closing in. And the one person who had stood by him through it all was about to become his greatest threat. Zara had spent the entire evening pacing the marble floors, the weight of what she had seen pressing down on her like a vice. The video played over and over in her mind. The grainy footage. The way he walked, the way he touched her. He didn't even try to hide it. That was the part that burned the most. He had gotten so comfortable in his lies that he thought she would never find out. That she would never do anything. He was wrong. When Kwame finally walked through the front doors, the tension in the house was suffocating. Zara was already waiting for him, arms crossed, phone gripped tightly in her hand. The moment he saw her face, saw the fury in her eyes, he knew. "You think I'm stupid?" Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. Before he could speak, before he could charm his way out of it like he always did, she hit play. His own laughter filled the room. The sound of his voice, unmistakable. The hotel lobby. The way he draped his arm around Amira like she belonged to him. The evidence was undeniable, playing at full volume, drowning out the excuses he hadn't even had the chance to make. Zara's hands shook, but her voice was steady. "I'm done." She turned on her heel and stormed into the bedroom, yanking open the closet doors and grabbing a suitcase. "You don't respect me. You don't respect this marriage." Kwame's pulse hammered in his ears. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. No one, talked to him like that. He had built an empire, controlled the world around him with precision. But in that moment, watching Zara shove clothes into a bag, watching her prepare to walk out of his life like he was nothing, something inside him snapped. She wasn't leaving. He moved without thinking, his body fueled by something dark and uncontrollable. In an instant, he was at the bedside drawer, fingers wrapping around cold metal. The chrome-plated .40 caliber pistol felt heavier than usual, like it knew what was about to happen. "Put the bag down." His voice was dangerously calm. Zara turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the gun in his hand. "Are you serious?" she whispered, disbelief flashing in her eyes. But Kwame didn't answer. His grip tightened. His mind raced. She was going to ruin him. If she walked out that door, she would take everything. His reputation. His career. His control. She wasn't leaving. 2 shots shattered the silence. One in the chest. One in the head. Kwame Renshaw had spent years controlling everything, his image, his music, his money, the people in his life. But now, standing over Zara's lifeless body, gun still warm in his hands, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Panic. The silence in the bedroom was deafening. The air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Blood, dark and glistening, spread across the floor, soaking into the expensive carpet. Zara's body lay motionless, her once defiant eyes now empty, staring at nothing. He had done it. No more arguing. No more threats. No more, "I'm done." She wasn't going anywhere. His breathing was uneven, hands trembling as he wiped sweat from his brow. He needed to think. He needed a plan. But before he could process what came next, his phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration cutting through the stillness like a knife. He didn't want to look, but he already knew. Amira. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, the name glowing in the dim light. She was calling, completely unaware that everything had just changed. That he had just crossed a line he could never uncross. He let it ring. Then again. And again. By the time the sun rose, he was already on the road, driving aimlessly through the city. His mind spiraled, his thoughts tangled in a mess of paranoia and regret. He needed something. Something familiar. Something his. He needed Amira. When he pulled up outside her luxury high-rise, his hands were still shaking. But not from fear. From something else. Something he couldn't name. Amira opened the door, her eyes immediately narrowing. She was perceptive, always had been. She could read his moods better than anyone. "Why do you look like that?" she asked, her voice cautious. Kwame didn't answer. He just stepped inside, letting the door shut behind him, sealing them in. Amira folded her arms. Something happened. I can feel it. Talk to me. He wanted to. He wanted to spill everything, to let it all out, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was too clouded, too heavy with the weight of what he had done. And then, she said something that made everything worse. I'm pregnant. 2 words. Just 2. But they hit him harder than any diss track, any fight, any betrayal he had ever faced. His entire body went cold. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the small, nervous smile playing at the edges of her lips. She thought this was good news. She thought he would be happy. She had no idea. A baby? Now. His entire world was already crumbling, and now she was adding this. A child meant more complications. More exposure. Another loose end. Another liability. Amira's smile faltered. Kwame, say something. But he couldn't. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything. His hands clenched into fists. His vision blurred. His breathing grew uneven. No. No, this couldn't be happening. And then, he moved. It was fast. Instinctive. Like muscle memory. The same way he had reached for the gun the night before, the same way his finger had found the trigger without hesitation. Kwame. She barely had time to react before the shot rang out. 1 bullet. Right between the eyes. Her body slumped backward onto the white couch, her head snapping back from the impact. Blood pooled instantly, staining the pristine fabric, seeping into the cushions. Her phone, resting on the coffee table, buzzed with an unread message. Someone checking in. Someone who would never get a response. And just like that, she was gone. Kwame exhaled shakily, lowering the gun, his mind an empty void. 2 women. 2 lives. 2 mistakes he could never take back. He had spent his entire career running the game. Controlling the narrative. Making sure every move was calculated, every risk worth taking. But now, for the first time in his life, Kwame Renshaw had no way out. For 3 days, Kwame Renshaw was the most wanted man in America. His name was everywhere, news headlines, social media, breaking updates on every major network. Helicopters circled overhead, reporters camped outside his mansion, and fans flooded the internet with speculation. Some refused to believe it. K-Dub wouldn't do this. Not him. Others weren't surprised at all. They had heard the aggression in his lyrics, seen the fire in his interviews. Maybe the fame, the pressure, the paranoia, it had finally consumed him. Meanwhile, Kwame was already miles away, moving in silence. The night he killed Amira, he knew his time was running out. He wiped down every surface he had touched, dumped his phone, and left the city under the cover of darkness. He drove west, past state lines, abandoning his car on the side of I-20 before switching to a stolen vehicle. He thought he had planned it well. No digital footprint, no predictable patterns. But what he didn't realize was that the police weren't just looking for him. The entire country was. Every major law enforcement agency was on high alert, the FBI, U.S. Marshals, even Homeland Security. Surveillance footage from traffic cameras, toll booths, gas stations, it all led back to one thing. Kwame was running. And he was running out of time. It was only hours after the killings that the news began to break. Local police had responded to a 911 call from a neighbor who heard loud gunshots coming from Amira Caldwell's luxury apartment. Authorities arrived to find her lifeless body sprawled on her white couch, a pool of blood slowly spreading across the fabric. But it wasn't until hours later that they discovered the second crime. Inside the sprawling mansion where Kwame had lived with his wife Zara, authorities were called after she failed to show up for an appointment. It was a routine welfare check that spiraled into the discovery of Zara's brutal murder. Her body was found in the master bedroom, a gruesome scene that made every cop in the room shudder. The connection between the two deaths was clear, the ruthless violence, the lack of any sign of a struggle. And the fact that both victims were tied to one man, the once untouchable K-Dub. As the investigation ramped up, the public began to piece it together. News outlets quickly filled in the gaps, and the first leaks came from sources close to the Renshaw family. A grainy clip surfaced, Zara confronting Kwame with the damning evidence of his affair with Amira. The video was played repeatedly on television, social media, and blogs, igniting a storm of questions. Was it a crime of passion? Was Kwame just a man at the edge, too overwhelmed by fame and his own demons to see the destruction he was causing? The manhunt began in earnest, as the authorities traced Kwame's every move, scouring surveillance footage, banking records, and cell towers. The nation was riveted. His fans, the same fans who had worshipped him for over a decade, were torn. Some swore they couldn't believe it, that it had to be a setup. Others knew all too well the dark side of fame, the rage that had always simmered in his music. Meanwhile, Kwame was already on the move. By the third day, he was exhausted. He hadn't slept. Had barely eaten. His mind was unraveling, paranoia creeping in like a slow poison. Every time he saw headlights in the distance, he flinched. Every time he heard sirens, his pulse skyrocketed. He knew what happened to men like him. They either died in a shootout, or they spent the rest of their lives rotting in a cage. And he wasn't sure which was worse. By the time he made it to Birmingham, Alabama, he was desperate. He found a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, one of those places where no one asked questions, where the carpet reeked of cigarettes, and the walls were thin enough to hear the couple next door arguing about rent money. He paid cash. Checked in under a fake name. And sat on the bed, gun in his lap, waiting for the inevitable. He knew they were coming. Maybe he had known it all along. The end came just after midnight. The red and blue lights cut through the night like neon ghosts, flashing through the dirty motel window. The sounds of tires screeching. Car doors slamming. Footsteps, heavy, fast, determined. Then, boom. The door burst open, splintering off its hinges. Armed agents flooded in, their weapons raised, laser sights cutting through the dimly lit room. Hands where we can see them. Kwame didn't move. He just sat there, staring down at the pistol in his hands. His fingers curled around the grip, slick with sweat. His breath was shallow. This was it. He could end it all right now. One bullet. One final act of control. But his hands were shaking too much. His grip faltered. And then, he dropped the gun. It clattered to the floor, the sound deafening in the silence. One of the agents moved in, yanking his arms behind his back, cold steel cuffs snapping around his wrists. As they dragged him out of the room, past the flashing cameras, past the crowd of onlookers whispering his name, Kwame didn't fight. Didn't speak. Didn't look up. Because he knew Kwame Renshaw was already dead. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Kwame Renshaw sat at the defendant's table, his eyes hollow, face a mask of cold detachment. His once immaculate appearance, the flashy jewelry, the designer suits, was now gone, replaced by the gray, ill-fitting prison jumpsuit that seemed to mock everything he once stood for. The man who had once commanded the stage, whose voice could shake entire arenas, was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. The trial had been a spectacle. His defense team, some of the best in the country, had come out swinging, throwing everything they could to secure his freedom. The insanity defense was their first line of attack. Claiming that Kwame was not responsible for his actions because the pressures of fame, coupled with childhood trauma, had pushed him over the edge. They argued that the world he lived in was one of constant surveillance, unrealistic expectations, and unrelenting pressure. They painted a picture of a man who couldn't escape the darkness that haunted him, who was suffocated by his own fame, unable to control the chaos inside his mind. They even suggested that Kwame's violent outbursts were a result of years of unresolved trauma, citing childhood abuse and a broken home as contributing factors. The courtroom fell silent as the defense attorney made their final plea, urging the jury to consider the man before them, a man who had been scarred, a man who had lived his life under the weight of an unforgiving spotlight. But the words fell flat. The jury listened intently, but the evidence was damning. 2 brutal murders. One driven by betrayal, the other by fear and a desperate need for control. The grainy video of Zara confronting him, the messages left by Amira, and the blood-stained scenes that had been forever seared into the memories of those who had investigated the case, they were all pieces of a puzzle that could not be ignored. And when it was time for the jury to deliberate, they didn't need long. In less than 2 hours, they reached a verdict. Guilty. Kwame didn't show any emotion as the verdict was read. His shoulders stiffened, but his face remained impassive, almost unreadable. The man who once thrived on the spotlight was now the one on trial, the one being judged. His life, his empire, his legacy, they had all crumbled. The prosecutor stood tall, her voice unwavering as she summarized the case. Kwame Renshaw took 2 lives, lives he claimed to love. He took them with no remorse, no regard for the people who cared about them. He may have been a legend in the world of hip-hop, but in this courtroom, he is nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. The families of the victims sat in the gallery, each dealing with the devastation in their own way. Zara's family was devastated, the loss of their daughter unbearable. Her mother, in particular, had been a quiet presence throughout the trial, but now she was front and center. As she took the stand, her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face. She spoke with a rawness, a pain that could never be truly understood unless you had lost a child. "You killed them like they were nothing," she said, her words trembling with grief and rage. "My daughter. That baby. Nothing you say can ever bring them back." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. The courtroom fell into an oppressive silence. Zara's mother's voice cracked, and she glanced toward Kwame, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to bleed from her very soul. Kwame didn't flinch. He didn't look at her. He didn't react. It was as if he had become numb to it all, completely detached from the reality of what he had done. When the judge delivered the sentence, there was no dramatic pause. No last-ditch appeals. The words were cold, final, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Kwame Renshaw, you are hereby sentenced to life without the possibility of parole." There was no applause. No cheers. Just the low murmur of the courtroom as people slowly processed what had just happened. Once a powerful icon, Kwame was now nothing more than another prisoner, another name to be lost in the system. The man who had once held the world in his hands, who had the money, the fame, the adoration of millions, was now just another inmate in a concrete cell. His fate was sealed. The story of his rise and fall, once a tale of glory and success, had now been reduced to a cautionary tale. A man who had everything, only to lose it all in an instant. The legacy of Kwame Renshaw would no longer be defined by platinum records or sold-out tours, but by the lives he had taken. And as the guards led him away, the world was left to wonder how a man so powerful, so admired, could have fallen so far. His empire was gone. His name was now a reminder of the darkness that could exist behind the glitz and glamour of fame. And though Kwame would never see the light of day again, the story of his destruction would echo for years to come. From superstardom to a prison cell, Kwame Renshaw's story is a chilling reminder of how power, control, and unchecked rage can destroy everything in its path. He had it all, fame, wealth, adoration, and yet it wasn't enough to keep the darkness at bay. Behind the flashy cars, the sold-out arenas, and the platinum records, there was a man slowly unraveling, consumed by paranoia, jealousy, and a deep need for control. Was he always a ticking time bomb, or did the constant pressures of fame and betrayal push him to his breaking point? His rise to the top was swift, but his fall was even quicker, leaving behind a trail of violence, heartbreak, and shattered lives. Could anything have stopped Kwame before it was too late? Was it the relentless pursuit of perfection that tore him apart? Or was he simply a victim of his own inner demons, unable to escape the weight of his own choices? This case raises more questions than it answers, about fame, about trust, and about the lengths to which a man will go to hold on to control. If this story shocked you, like and subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest sides of fame, love, and violence. The truth isn't always pretty, and sometimes the most shocking stories are the ones we never see coming.